Welcome back. Well, there's an event in South Africa today to mark the Chinese New Year. The Chinese ambassador to South Africa, Chen Xiaodong, hosted it. Our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, also sent a message of support. It turns out that China is now Africa's biggest trading partner. We, as South Africa, make up about 20% of the trade between our continent and China. Sanusha Naidu is at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Sanusha, good afternoon to you. I mean, there seems to me to be no doubt that over the last 20 years, China and Africa, and China and South Africa, have got a lot closer than they used to be.
Indeed, Stephen. Good afternoon to you and the listeners and the viewers. It definitely has. I mean, last year was the 20th anniversary of the China-Africa Forum that was hosted in Senegal, Dakar, and it was quite an important event to showcase and to reflect on how deep this relationship has become. You know, China's economic, political footprint has become quite an important characterization in terms of Africa's external partnerships, and Africa's relationship with China has also deepened perhaps in terms of its political dynamics, as well as in terms of trade. That China sees South Africa as a very important trading partner, an important economic architecture in Africa's trade. And last year, I think just before the FOCAC summit, the Chinese released statistics which show that trade had actually reached over 240 billion US dollars. I think it's almost been now marked in terms of getting to that 300 billion mark. So I think at the end of the day, it shows you how China has evolved in its deepening partnerships, its deepening presence in Africa, but also at a time when Africa is finding to reconstitute or recalibrate some of its external partnerships. We know next month is going to be the EU-AU summit, very important summit again in terms of the external relationships with the EU countries. And I think the China space has actually now also evolved in terms of not being just in the infrastructure space, but we look at the outcomes of the 9 commitments that President Xi Jinping outlined last year. Digital diplomacy, digital economy, the digital infrastructure, health diplomacy has been very key. The Chinese had also spoke a lot about and donated a billion vaccines at last year's FOCAC.
I mean, it seemed at one point that Chinese influence on Africa was going to just continually increase, that there was going to be a lot more integration between the two. China started the Belt and Road Initiative. It seems in some ways that maybe China is pulling back a little bit. I mean, is this sort of big infrastructure initiative going as well as China would have liked, do you think? Is there a rationale why they may be pulling back a little bit?
I would say that when you look at the lens in which this debate about whether China's infrastructure funding has kind of come, not necessarily pulling back, I think it's much more matured in a way. It's not going to be the kind of high-level, big-ticket items. I think it's much more based on succinct interpretation of how this fits in with Africa's development. Yes, you're still going to have the big infrastructure, and I know that there's been reports in the Financial Times and other Western media kind of asking the question, is China now pulling back? And there's this whole narrative which can constitute another interview on its own about the debt diplomacy question. Is China re-indebting Africa? But I think the challenge here is not to look at it in those kinds of binary lenses. The challenge here is to ask the question is, what is the infrastructure that Africa needs? It's moving into the digital space. You're hearing a lot about China's digital diplomacy, the health diplomacy, the infrastructure around those connectivity projects, which are still going to remain key for China and Africa in terms of infrastructure development, connecting ports, connecting rail and road, connecting to different types of connectivity corridors and so forth. And that's going to be key in this infrastructure drive. I think the question around it is whether or not, where China does feel that there may be certain levels of risk, and we can't ignore that, it's going to be much more interpretive of that investment. So I think at the end of the day, we've got to be a bit more careful and cautious because we're still waiting for the other infrastructure funding to come through in terms of what the U.S. President spoke about in terms of Prosper Africa and so forth. We're looking at where AGOA is going, etc. And of course, you must remember as well is that the big infrastructure tickets is also linked to, in terms of what was presented last year at FOCAC, in terms of PIDA, the big infrastructure development corridors, and of course the other NEPAD programs as well.
So on one level, the sort of economic relationship is pretty easy to assess. We can, the trade statistics from both countries, the different governments that obviously have different views on that. There's also, though, a different question which may be impossible to assess, which is how are the two societies, our society influencing China, Chinese society influencing us? Let me sort of use an example. It would seem to me that we, as South Africa, has influenced British society in some important ways. Nelson Mandela is a major figure in British society. Nando's is a major feature of British society. I think there are probably things we can point to and say that British society has affected us. Are we affecting China? Is China affecting us socially? Is that impossible to assess, maybe?
I think it's much more about understanding the different cultural dynamics, the elements of society, both in South Africa and China. I think there's still levels in which we still have to gain deeper knowledge around how these different societies operate and the kinds of dynamics that evolve in these societies. I think that one of the interesting things about the Chinese society is how much it has evolved over the last 20 years in terms of the knowledge, in terms of its own engagement with the rest of the world, and how much of the knowledge has actually kind of filtered into African societies, particularly through your Confucius institutes and so forth. Are we influencing that space? I think we are. I think we are influencing it because, when I was in China in the last 20 years, you kind of see more and more information about Africa coming out. Maybe not enough, but I think essentially it's a space where if you listen to Ambassador Chen or you listen to the Foreign Minister Wang Yi when he was here on his visit earlier in the year, in Africa, you hear a lot about that people-to-people exchange. And I think that's where we got to understand that we can't compare how influence is. Influence in a society like the UK versus the influence in a society like China has to be measured according to the dynamics of that relationship. And I see it evolving. I think there's greater knowledge to be had, definitely in terms of understanding some of the key cultural etiquettes that we have that may be a little bit different in how we do business, how we have interpersonal relations, but the Confucius Institutes have been important, but so too has been this whole cultural dynamic around the biggest internal migration that happens in the world every year is the Chinese lunar moon calendar New Year. And this is the year of the tiger, so it's going to be very important for us to understand how these dynamics work. And China is a big country, so you can't just link our influence or how we understand China according to how we understand Beijing. We got to understand Shanghai. We got to understand Hangzhou. We got to understand different parts of China that is also very heterogeneous in its context.
The other thing, of course, is that, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen this in the last sort of 5 or 6 years. People in our society saying, I wish we were more like China because they get things done. You see people saying similar things about Rwanda, and yet our political system is so different. I think freedom has become very entrenched in our society. I think that's important. China, of course, is very different. You mentioned human rights in China, or to Chinese government officials. We see this in the relationship between the Americans and the Chinese all the time. You mention that issue, and suddenly you're going to get a big response.
Well, I think it's the interpretation of it. I'm not saying that it's not part of the dynamic. I think the question of how things are done in China versus how it's done elsewhere, again, comes back to your social setting, comes back to your structural conditions, comes back to your political dynamics and arena. I think the question of human rights has to be contextualized in terms of how the interpretation of human rights is. In many societies that follow a kind of Westphalian model in terms of the way in which they centralize the Bill of Rights in their political and social setting and economic setting. The question is, what do you do with your political rights versus your economic rights? I think one of the interesting things about the way human rights is interpreted around the world in terms of your universal values is really around the question of how your rights in terms of individual, in terms of how do you put those rights into practice versus the practice of your economic rights. I think if you ask the question, or you flip your question around, Stephen, and ask it in a different way, it's like Kwame Nkrumah is saying, you need to be politically free and all else will follow. So seek your political freedom first and all else will follow. To flip it around and ask South Africans in terms of where we are currently with our economy, our inflation, the Reserve Bank putting up the repo rate, people will say to you, yeah, we're politically free, but we're still economically struggling. So I think those are different dynamics and nuances to the question of human rights.
Sanusha Naidu, thanks very much indeed. So much more to talk about in our relationship with China. It's a very, very big issue. Sanusha Naidu is at the Institute for Global Dialogue.